Today, I want to talk about the first real graphic novel, and it's Will Eisner's A Contract with God. What makes this work so special? Why can it be called the first real graphic novel? Let's go and find out. Nowadays, graphic novels are the fastest growing segment in the book publishing industry. They are well established, and publishers and critics take them serious as works of art. At the same time, comic book makers have become more mature, more artistic, and more serious. When Will Eisner in the 1950s met somebody at a cocktail party and told him that he was a comic book artist, the other person said, "How dreadful for you," simply turned around and walked away. In the 1950s, comics were seen as a threat to young minds because comic books depicted crime, violence, sexiness. So the result was a kind of censorship that worked as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because comic books were no longer allowed to deal with mature themes, they became an infantile medium. And both readers and producers left the industry. By the late 1950s, the comic book industry had hit rock bottom both from an economic standpoint and creatively. But by the late 1960s, a new generation of graphic artists returned to the medium. Outside of the established comic book press, they started to self-create, self-publish, and self-distribute works of graphic art. That revitalized the comic book industry and also caused Will Eisner to return to the medium and push its boundaries. Because by the late 1970s, Will Eisner was a comic book veteran. He had been there in the 1930s when comic books first emerged. He had started his own studio where he produced comic books and also trained others to make them. In the 1940s, he pushed the boundaries of the medium by creating a highbrow comic strip, The Spirit, for a lowbrow audience. And in the 1970s, he returned to the medium to once again push its limits. So what is this graphic novel about? Well, A Contract with God collects 4 stories, all of which are set in 1930s the Bronx, New York. And the stories are set in a housing block, which is mainly inhabited by poor immigrant people. And it tells about their hopes, their desires, their dreams, but also their failures and their disappointments, their heartbreak. It tells the story of poor but resilient people. The title story is about Frimme Hirsch, a pious, believing Jew who loses his daughter to a tragic illness and then calls out God saying, "Hey God, we had a contract. I have upheld my end of the bargain. Why can't you?" What makes this work so special? Well, first of all, the story is autobiographical, for Will Eisner had really lived in such a tenement block, and he really had lost his daughter. Furthermore, this story is told in a distinct, expressive style that we do not see in other comic books or graphic works. And finally, there's this level of sophistication. With the title, A Contract with God, this story of course refers back to the Old Testament, the book of Job, but also to Joseph Roth's Job and to Goethe's Faust. Of course, Will Eisner was not the first to use the term graphic novel. But when we compare his work to other books that claim to have been the first real graphic novel, we see what makes A Contract with God so special. Take for an example It Rhymes with Lust from the 1950s. This was the first time that authors of pulp novels teamed up with a graphic artist to tell a full-length picture novel. It Rhymes with Lust is a great story told in a great way. But at the same time, it's simply a comic book, but then a bit longer. Had the chapters been published in monthly installments, nobody would have seen the difference. Or take, for an example, the graphic novels published in the 1970s by Marvel. Eager to get on the train of new comic book formats, Marvel teamed up with Simon & Schuster to create full-length superhero comic books. At first sight, these graphic albums look rather nice. They are published on better paper and printed with better colors. But look a bit closer and they disappoint. Comic book makers at the time were trained to make 22-page comics, and they were not yet trained to do full-length albums. Furthermore, these kinds of stories remained firmly within the superhero genre. A third work that claims to be one of the first graphic novels is Murder by Remote Control. This is a surreal detective story. A special agent is called to an island to solve a murder. What is interesting about this book is that before it was published in the US, it was published in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, it was seen as just another graphic album like all the others, and not as a fundamentally new publishing format, not as a graphic novel. Now we can see what makes Will Eisner's work so special. It is autobiographical, it has a distinct visual style, and it is sophisticated in its reference to other works. Graphic novels are the fastest growing segment in the book publishing industry. But if you want to find out where that started, then A Contract with God is the place to go. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell. And especially ringing the bell is important, because with all these bells I will exchange them for photon torpedoes, which I will then use to conquer the entire galaxy.